The cabin sat on a stubborn piece of ground, a gravelly slope that caught the morning sun but never seemed to keep it. Eliza Thorne stood at her window on the first day of spring, watching the light slide over the rocks and disappear into the shadow of the mountain. She had been here 3 winters now, long enough to know that this land was beautiful in a cruel way. The valley below was rich, dark soil, where wheat grew tall and corn stood straight. Up here, the earth was thin, and the wind was constant, and every season was a test she had not yet passed. That morning, she was eating the last of the salt pork her father had cured before he died. The flour bin was nearly empty. The debt at Bridger's Mercantile had grown again over the winter, and she had no way to pay it except the land itself, which everyone said was worthless. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, stories of women who were counted out before they began, who turned the very things that made them seem weak into the tools of their survival. Eliza Thorne's story begins in that cold cabin, with a father's grave still fresh and a storekeeper's ledger growing red in the margins. And it begins with a seed most people would have thrown away. Eliza had been born in a sod house on the open plains, the only child of a Missouri farmer and a mother who had come west in a wagon. Her mother had died when Eliza was 12, and the only thing she left was a tin box of seeds sewn into the hem of her coat, and a phrase she had whispered to Eliza the night before she passed. "The warmth hides in stone, child. It waits for a clever hand to find it." Eliza had remembered those words, but she had not understood them. For years, she had thought it was a kind of riddle, something her mother had made up to comfort her. But after her father died, after she had come to this stony slope with nothing but the land and the debt and the seeds in the tin, she began to wonder. The cabin was built against the south face of a low ridge, a shelf of basalt that soaked up the sun all day and held it through the night. She had noticed it on her first evening here, when the frost had already settled in the valley below, but the stone by the door was still warm to the touch. She had pressed her hand to it, and for a moment she had felt something like hope. But the summer that followed had been a disaster. She had planted corn and beans in the usual way, in rows on the flat part of her land, and watched them struggle and fail. The soil was too thin, the wind too strong, and the growing season too short. By September, she had harvested what might have kept a family for a month, but it was not enough to pay a single dollar of the debt. And the valley below had laughed. They said she was a girl playing at farming, that her father had left her nothing but a fool's errand. The worst of them was Silas Bridger, who owned the Mercantile and held her father's note. He had come up the hill himself at harvest time, a thin man with a gold watch chain and a voice like honey. "You don't have to stay up here, Miss Thorne," he had said, counting out the coins she owed him with a slow, deliberate hand. "I'll take the land off your hands at a fair price. Enough to settle the debt and put you on the stage to Portland. A woman alone can't keep a farm on this hill." She had thanked him and sent him away, but his words had stayed. She had no one to help her, no brothers or uncles, no neighbor who would lend a hand. The nearest farm was 3 miles down the slope, where the Hellstroms milked cows and did not think much of a girl growing vegetables on a rock pile. And so that spring, as the snow began to melt and the wind turned warm, Eliza found herself standing at the south wall of the cabin, with the morning light falling on the dark stone, and the memory of her mother's voice rising out of the silence. The warmth hides in stone. She did not have a plan. She had only an impulse, a feeling that the words meant something more than comfort. That day, she walked down to the valley for supplies, and she bought something the Hellstroms laughed at. She bought a bushel of tomato seeds. "Tomatoes?" Hellstrom's wife said from her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Those won't grow here. Too short a season. You'll freeze before they set a single fruit." Eliza had nodded and kept walking. She bought the seeds and a spool of heavy twine, and a handful of nails from the blacksmith, a quiet man named Daniel Crane, who had a little girl named Ruthie. Daniel did not laugh. He only asked what she was building. "A trellis," she said, "on the south wall of the cabin." He had looked at her for a long moment, his hand still on the bellows, and then he had nodded. "I'll bring you more nails if you need them." She walked home with the seeds in her apron pocket and the spool of twine over her shoulder. and she could feel the weight of their laughter like a stone in her chest. But she could also feel the warmth of that south wall, even from a distance, as if the stone were calling to her. That evening, she sat on the step, watching the sunset stain the sky, and she thought about her mother. She thought about the long journey west, the sod house, the seeds sewn into the hem of a coat. And she thought about the way her mother had pressed her hand to the chimney stones after the fire died and said, "Feel that, Eliza. The heat doesn't disappear, it hides. It waits in things that hold it." She had not understood then, but she understood now. The cabin was built of stone. The south wall had been sun-warmed every day for decades. If she could make a trellis against that wall, if she could train the tomatoes to climb that stone, they would draw the heat from the rock and ripen before the frost came. It was a strange idea. It was the kind of idea that got a woman called foolish, that made the men in town shake their heads and the women whisper behind their hands. But there was another kind of knowing, deeper than the talk of neighbors. It was the knowing that came from touching the warm stone at dusk, from feeling the day's light held in stone long after the cold had fallen. She decided to trust that knowing. The next morning she began to build. She gathered the broken barrel hoops from the old cooper's shed, their iron rusted but strong. She drove nails into the mortar between the stones, spaced every 2 feet, and bent the hoops into wide loops fixed to the wall. Then she strung the twine between them, a loose net that climbed from the ground to the eaves. It took her 3 days. Her hands bled from the wire and the nailing. Her back ached from reaching. But when she was done, the whole south wall of the cabin wore a basketwork of iron and string, like the rib cage of a giant creature reaching for the sun. The valley thought she had lost her mind. The Hellstrom's eldest boy, a lanky youth named Otto, rode past with his friends and shouted, "Look at that! She's growing spiderwebs on her house!" The women at the general store exchanged glances when she walked in, and one of them, a Mrs. Bellwether, said loudly, "Some folks just aren't meant for farming. Nothing wrong with admitting it." But Eliza did not slow down. She planted the tomato seeds in little pots made of old cans, set them on the windowsill to start. When the spring rains came, she carried them outside and tucked them into the soil at the foot of the trellis. And then she waited. The valley did not wait. The spring turned warm, and the valley's flat fields were plowed and planted in the old way, row after row of corn and beans and pumpkins stretching toward the sky. They did not need a wall. They had deep soil and irrigation ditches, and the blessing of the low land. Eliza's slope was a joke, and the trellis was the punchline. She heard the laughter. It reached her even way up high, carried on the wind. But she also heard another sound, the sound of the south wall breathing warmth in the evening, and the small green shoots of the tomatoes climbing the twine, reaching for the stone. She saw the first tendril curl around the iron hoop, and she felt something that had been missing for a long time. She felt like she was not alone. The plants grew faster than she had ever seen tomatoes grow. By the 4th week, they were waist-high, their leaves spread wide against the warm stone, drinking the stored heat. The valley's tomatoes were still lagging, pale and small in the cold bottom soil, and the Hellstroms, who had never grown tomatoes at all, came to gawk when they drove past. The Hellstrom boy, Otto, stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets, staring. "That's not natural," he said. "They're growing like ivy." Eliza did not answer. She just watered the roots at dusk, as she had learned to do, so the water would not chill the stone. She covered the soil with straw to keep the moisture in, and she tied each new tendril to the trellis, spreading the vines wide so every leaf caught the light. By July, the south wall was a curtain of green, studded with yellow blossoms. The first fruit appeared like small green beads, and the sight of them made Eliza's heart beat faster. She had never seen tomatoes set fruit this early, not even in the valley's best years. The warmth of the stone had bought her a month, maybe more. She was ahead of everyone, and she knew it. But she also knew what it meant to be ahead in a place that wanted you to fail. The mockery had not stopped, but it had changed. It had become quieter, more speculative. Mrs. Bellwether had come up the hill one afternoon, pretending to be neighborly, and had stood in front of the green wall with her mouth slightly open. "Well, I never," she said. "They'll freeze the first cold night, All that greenery will suck the warmth out of the stone." Eliza had not argued. She just waited until dusk and pressed Mrs. Bellwether's hand to the stone. "Feel that," she said. The older woman had stiffened, and then she had gone quiet. She had pulled her hand away as if she had touched something forbidden, and she had left without another word. The stone held, the heat stayed, and the tomatoes ripened. By the end of July, the first fruits were turning red, and Eliza picked them warm from the vine, still holding the heat of the day in their skins. She packed a basket and drove down to the market, and the hotel cook bought the whole lot before the sun was fully up. "Be back next week with more," he said. "I'll take all you have." She drove home an hour later, her pockets full of coins, and the debt seemed a little smaller, the land a little more hers. But she also noticed that the laughter had stopped, and in its place had come something else, a kind of watchfulness. And she knew, with a deep and certain knowing, that the cold would come, and when it did, the wall would be tested. And she had to hope that the warmth hiding in the stone was enough. The sun this evening fell over the hills, turning the wall orange and gold. Eliza pressed her hand to it, and it was warm, warm as a living thing. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. Then she looked down at the valley, where the fields were still green and the farmers were laughing, and she thought of her mother's voice. She thought of the tin of seeds, still half full, and she thought of the frost that would come. "It is time to prove them wrong, Mama," she whispered to the wind, and the wind carried the words away, down to the valley where the corn was just beginning to tassel. She did not know it yet, but the quiet evening had already become a cliff. The first star came out above the mountain, and a chill settled into the air that September had never held before. The chill that settled into the air that evening was not a passing thing. It stayed through the night and into the next morning, and when Eliza woke, the window was frosted on the inside. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence. The birds were quiet. The wind had stopped. It was the kind of stillness that pressed against the eardrums, the stillness that came before a long winter. She rose and built the fire, and while the cabin warmed, she went to the south wall. The frost had touched the edges of the leaves, the outer ones that reached beyond the protection of the stone, but the main vines were unharmed. The fruit hung red and firm, still warm where the rock had held the night's cold at bay. She picked what was ripe, filling 2 baskets before the sun was fully up, and she drove them down to the hotel before the dew had dried. The cook, a stout man named Greeley, who had been at the landing for 15 years, took them without a word. He paid in silver, and he did not smile. "You'll be the only one with tomatoes in a week," he said. "The cold is coming. I can smell it." Eliza drove home with the silver in her pocket and the knowledge pressing against her ribs. She had maybe 2 weeks, maybe less. The wall would hold, she believed that, but there was a price to pay for being the only one with a crop. She knew it the moment she walked into Bridger's Mercantile to settle a small portion of her debt. Silas Bridger was behind the counter, polishing the glass of a display case. He did not look up when she entered. She set the coins on the counter, a stack of silver that covered the interest and a little of the principal, and waited. He looked at the coins, then at her, and his eyes did not warm. "That's a nice bit of money for a girl with a rock pile," he said. "The hotel cook's been telling folks you're selling tomatoes." "Early tomatoes." "Yes, sir. Must be a trick of the soil up there," he said. "Some kind of warm spring." He was fishing. She knew it. The whole valley wanted to know how she had done it, and she had told no one. Not the Hellstroms, not Mrs. Bellwether, not even Daniel Crane, though he had asked once, kindly, and she had given him a vague answer about the wall. She did not want to share it, not yet, not until she had proved that it worked all the way through. "The soil's thin and rocky," she said, "but the south wall gets good sun." Bridger tapped the coins with one finger. "I've heard you built something on that wall, some kind of trellis. Just a place for the vines to climb." "Tomatoes don't climb, Miss Thorne." "These do." He waited for her to say more. She did not. He picked up the coins and dropped them into a drawer, making a note in his ledger with a slow, deliberate hand. "You know the debt is due in full at the end of October. If you can't pay it, the bank will take the land. There's no way around that." "I know. And if you can't pay it, I'll have to call in the note. I'll be first in line at the auction." I understand, Mr. Bridger. He closed the ledger and looked at her with something that was not quite a smile. I hope you do, because a season of early tomatoes isn't a farm. It's a lucky break, and luck runs out. She left the store with the words like cold water on her skin. He was right, in a way. One good season was not enough. She would need a second, and a third, and she would need the means to pay for seed and nails and flour all through the winter. But there was something else in his voice, something that went beyond business. He wanted her gone. He wanted the land. The hill had a view of the river that people paid money to see, and he had mentioned once, in passing, that he had a cousin in Portland who was looking for a summer property. She could feel him circling. The next morning she was working on the trellis, tightening a loose wire, when a wagon pulled up the lane. It was Mrs. Hellstrom, with her son Otto, and a basket of preserves she pretended was a welcome. She climbed down and stood in the yard, looking at the wall with a curiosity she did not try to hide. I heard you were selling early tomatoes, she said. I didn't believe it. You can have one if you like. Eliza plucked a ripe fruit from the vine and handed it over. Mrs. Hellstrom took it, turned it over in her hands and bit into it. The juice ran down her chin. She did not wipe it away. That's the best tomato I've had in years, she said. How did you do it? The wall, Eliza said. Stone holds the heat. That's all? That's all. Mrs. Hellstrom looked at the wall, at the barrel hoops and the twine, the vines spreading green and heavy, and she shook her head. I've been farming this valley for 20 years. I've never seen the like. She wiped her chin with the back of her hand. You should patent that idea. Sell it. I'm not ready to sell it yet. When you are, you come see me. We could do a deal. She climbed back into the wagon, and Otto, who had been staring at the wall with the same open gaze, said, The boys call it the spider wall. They dare each other to touch it. Eliza did not laugh. The wall had become a thing apart from her, a kind of legend on the hillside. And legends attracted trouble. The trouble came in the form of a cold night at the end of August. The wind shifted. The barometer dropped, and old Pruitt, who had farmed the valley for 40 years, stood up in church and said the frost was coming in a week, maybe less. The valley went into a quiet frenzy. The Hellstroms harvested every green tomato they had and wrapped them in newspaper to ripen indoors. The hotel cook bought every last peach and bean from the bottomland farms. And the farmers stood in their fields, looking at the sky, waiting for the end. Eliza did not hurry. She had already harvested most of her crop, selling it to Greeley and to the wives of the valley who had overcome their mockery enough to buy. The wall was still heavy with green fruit, and she knew that if the frost came, the stone would protect them. She had done the arithmetic in her ledger, the same arithmetic her mother had taught her. The stone held the day's heat for 8 hours after sundown. The coldest part of the night was just before dawn. If the frost came at midnight, the stone would still be warm enough to shield the vines. If it came at 4 in the morning, the stone would be cooling, but the warmth would still be there, a blanket against the killing cold. She felt something like confidence, a quiet flame that she had not allowed herself to stoke. But there was another worry, one she had not named. She had seen Bridger's eyes when she had left the mercantile. She had seen the way he asked about her trellis. She had seen him driving past her property twice in 3 days, not stopping, just looking. A man who wanted the land that much would not let a successful harvest stop him. He would find another way. She did not know what that way was, but she knew her mother's old saying, "The varmints come for the corn, but the thieves come for the field itself." The frost came on a Wednesday night, the last day of August. Eliza was sitting by the fire, the ledger open on her lap, when the temperature dropped so fast she felt it in her bones. She went outside, wrapped in her father's old coat, and stood in the yard looking at the sky. The stars were sharp and cold, and the air had a stillness that felt like a held breath. She walked to the south wall and pressed her hand to the stone. It was warm, still holding the heat of the day. She felt a wave of relief, and then she heard the sound. A creak, a footstep on gravel. She turned, her heart suddenly loud in the silence, and she saw a shape in the darkness at the edge of the orchard. A man, standing very still, watching her. "Who's there?" she called. The shape did not move. The wind blew and the shape was gone. She walked to the orchard, but there was nothing. The gravel was undisturbed. She told herself it was a trick of the moonlight, the shadow of a tree, her own fear projecting itself onto the dark. But she did not believe it. She went back inside, but she slept in her clothes, the lantern trimmed low, and she dreamed of her mother's hand pressed to the warm stone, her mother's voice saying, "Thieves come for the field itself." She woke at dawn to a world gone white. The frost had settled on every surface, a thick rime that glittered in the cold light. She dressed and went outside, and she saw the valley. The bottomland fields were black. The corn had collapsed, the beans were shriveled, the tomatoes were hanging like frozen marbles. The Hellstrom's barn roof was white, and the cows were standing close together, breathing steam into the still air. Her own rose, the corn and beans she had planted in the old way, were dead. They had never had a chance. She walked to the south wall with her hands held stiff at her sides. The stone was cold on the surface, but she could feel the warmth beneath, the stored heat of yesterday holding. She crouched and looked at the lowest leaves. They were green, alive. She touched a tomato. It was firm and cool, but not frozen. The wall had held. She stood up and looked at the dead valley, and she felt a sharp, quiet joy that she almost pushed away, because it felt like triumph over people she did not want to hurt. She had not wanted them to fail. She had only wanted to survive. The wall had held, but she had not made it whole. As she walked along the trellis, checking each vine, she found it, a section near the east end of the wall, about 6 feet long, where the netting had been cut. Not torn, cut clean, with a blade. The vines had sagged and fallen, their leaves black, the fruit shriveled and dead. Someone had done this in the night while she had been inside. Someone had cut her trellis, exposing the vines to the frost. She knelt in the frozen dirt, and she saw something else. A boot print, deep and clear, with a worn heel patched in a half-moon of new leather. A town boot, not a farm boot. She covered the print with a piece of bark and stood up, her hands shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She stayed by the boot print until the sun was fully up, memorizing every detail. The half-moon patch of new leather on the left heel, the way the sole had worn smooth at the ball of the foot, the deep impression of the heel nail. She drew it in her ledger, measuring the length and width against her ruler, and then she covered it again with the bark and a flat stone to keep it safe. The cut netting she did not touch. She left it hanging, a wound in the green wall, and she went inside to build the fire and think. The frost had taken the valley, but it had not taken her wall, not all of it. The slashed section was a loss, a hard one, but the rest of the vine still hung heavy with fruit, protected by the stone. She picked what she could, filling 2 baskets, and drove down to the hotel before the morning had fully broken. The road was quiet. Every farm she passed was black with ruin. The Hellstrom's fields were dead, the corn stalks bent and frozen, the cows standing in a huddle with frost on their backs. She did not stop. She could not bear to see their faces. At the hotel, Greeley was standing on the porch, staring at the dead garden behind the kitchen. He turned when he saw her wagon, and his face changed. "You've got more," he said. The wall held. He took the baskets without haggling, paid her in gold this time, and said, "You're the only one with anything fresh in 50 miles. I'll pay double next week if you've got it." She drove home with the gold in her pocket, but the weight of it did not ease her mind. She kept seeing the boot print, the clean cut of the netting, the way the shape had stood in the orchard the night before. Someone had come for her wall. Someone had wanted it to fail. And she knew, with a certainty that sat cold in her stomach, that Silas Bridger had sent them. She did not go to the mercantile that day. She did not want to see his face, to hear his voice pretending sympathy. She went instead to the blacksmith's forge, where Daniel Crane was working a piece of iron, his daughter Ruthie sitting on a stool nearby, shelling peas into a bowl. He looked up when she entered, and he saw something in her face that made him set down his hammer. "What happened?" he said. "Someone cut my trellis last night, the night of the frost. They cut a section of netting so the cold could get in." He straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. "Did you see who?" "No, but I found a boot print, a town boot with a patched heel, half-moon of new leather." He was quiet for a long moment. "Bridger." "That's my guess." "I've seen that boot," he said slowly. "He came in last week for a new shoe on his horse. Sat on that bench right there, and I noticed his left heel, patched with a half-moon. It's a distinctive repair. Deming the cobbler does it that way." "I need to prove it," she said. "I need to have him put his boot in that print." "He won't do it willingly." "Then I need witnesses, people who see him and see the print and know what it means." Daniel picked up his hammer again, turning it in his hands. "The whole valley lost their crops last night. Every bottomland field is dead. They're desperate, Eliza. Desperate people will believe any story they're told. Bridger's already been spreading it around that you cut your own trellis, for the sympathy, to get people to buy your tomatoes out of pity." The words hit her like a blow. "That's a lie." "I know it's a lie, but it's a lie that's easy to swallow. A woman alone, a strange trellis, a fortunate survival. People want to believe it because it makes them feel better about their own loss. If you cheated, then they didn't lose to the frost. They lost to a cheat." She sat down on the anvil, the heat of the forge washing over her. She had known Bridger would move against her, but she had not expected this. A lie that turned her into the villain of the very disaster that had saved her. "You need to show them," Daniel said. "You need to show the whole valley the wall, the cut netting, the boot print, the proof. Let them see what kind of man their merchant is." "I was planning to do that," she said. "I was going to invite them up, but I was going to wait until I had more fruit, until I could prove the wall worked over a full season." "You don't have a full season. You have a week, maybe 2, before Bridger calls in your debt. If you wait, you'll lose the land." She looked at him, at his steady eyes and his quiet hands, and she made a decision. "I'll do it Saturday. I'll invite the whole valley to come see the wall." "Can you help me spread the word?" "I can." He set down the hammer and took his daughter's hand. "I'll start today." She went home with a plan, but the plan felt thin, like a piece of paper held against a wind. She had the boot print, but Bridger was a respected man, a merchant with years of credit and goodwill. She was a lone woman on a rocky hill, a widow's daughter with a strange trellis and a ledger full of debt. The valley might not believe her. They might laugh again, or worse, they might turn away and let the debt take the land. The next 3 days were the longest of her life. She worked the wall from dawn to dusk, harvesting every ripe fruit, mending the cut netting with new twine, and writing in her ledger every detail of the frost night. She measured the dead section and the living section, drew a diagram of how the heat of the stone had held the frost at bay, documented the angle of the sun and the temperature of the rock at evening. She turned her ledger into a witness, a mute testimony that would speak for her when her voice might fail. Word spread. Daniel did his work well. By Thursday, every household in the valley had heard that Eliza Thorne was opening her farm on Saturday morning to show the wall that had survived the frost. The reaction was mixed. Some were curious, hungry for any good news after the ruin. Others were suspicious, repeating Bridger's lie that she had cut her own trellis for sympathy. A few, like Mrs. Hellstrom, were quietly on her side, and they came by the cabin in 1s and 2s to offer support. Old Pruitt came on Friday afternoon, driving his wagon slowly up the hill with a basket of early apples from his cellar. He sat on her step and looked at the wall for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I've seen a lot of frosts in my time. I've never seen a wall beat one like this." "The stone holds the heat," she said. "I've got stone walls on my own place. Never thought to use them." "Most people don't." He nodded, chewing on a stem of grass. "That boy Bridger is a snake. I've always known it. But he's a smooth snake, and he's got the valley's ear. Tomorrow, you'll be standing alone in front of a crowd that's half angry and half hopeful. You'll need to show them something they can't argue with. I'll show them the wall. Show them the cut netting. Show them the boot print. And then show them the arithmetic. The numbers don't lie, even when people do." He left her with the apples, and a feeling that she was not as alone as she had thought. That night, she stood at the wall one last time, her hand on the warm stone, and she thought of her mother. She thought of the seeds in the tin, the coat hem, the long journey west. Her mother had survived the plains, the loss of a husband, the cold of a sod house in winter. She had pressed her daughter's hand to the chimney stone and said, "The warmth hides in things that hold it." Eliza pressed her own hand to the stone now, and she felt the heat, deep and steady, like a promise. She would hold. She would not be cut down. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and cold. She rose before light, built a fire, and put on her best dress, the one she had saved for church. She braided her hair tightly and pinned it. She checked the boot print under the stone, still there, clear as the night she had found it. She checked the cut netting, the sagging vines, the blackened leaves. She set her ledger on a barrel near the wall, open to the page of the frost night, with the diagram and the measurements. Then she went outside to wait. The first wagon came at sunup. It was old Pruitt, alone, with a flask of coffee and a nod of greeting. The second was the Hellstroms, Mr. and Mrs. and Otto, their faces drawn but curious. The third was a family she did not know, from the far end of the valley, who had lost everything. By 8 o'clock, the hillside was crowded with wagons and horses, and people standing in the frosty grass, their breath pluming, their eyes fixed on the green wall and the red fruit hanging against the stone. Silas Bridger arrived last, driving his buggy up the lane with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He climbed down and stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his patched left heel hidden by the frost. Eliza took a breath. She stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were trembling. "I know you've lost your crops. I know this winter will be hard. I lost my own flat rows, the ones I planted the way we all plant. They're dead, just like yours." She gestured at the wall. "But this one lived, and I want to show you why." She walked to the wall and pressed her palm against the stone. "Feel that," she said. "The stone holds the day's heat all night long. The sun warms it, and the stone keeps the warmth. It radiates back, slow and steady, even when the air drops below freezing. The frost settled everywhere else, but here, against this wall, the warmth held." She led them along the wall, letting them touch the stone, feel the lingering heat. She showed them the living vines, the red fruit, the leaves untouched by frost. Then she stopped at the cut section. "But someone tried to stop it," she said. The crowd went still. She pointed at the clean cut in the netting, the blackened vines, the dead fruit. This was cut, not torn, not broken by wind, cut with a blade on the night of the frost, so the cold could pour in and kill this part of the wall. A murmur ran through the crowd. She knelt and lifted the stone, revealing the boot print in the soft earth, crisp and clear. "I found this print the next morning," she said. "A town boot, a left heel patched with a half-moon of new leather. I've had it checked by the cobbler in town. He made that patch on a pair of boots 2 weeks ago. He remembers the customer." She looked up, straight at Silas Bridger, who had gone very still at the edge of the crowd. "I'm not here to accuse a man falsely," she said. "I'm only asking that the owner of that boot step forward and put his foot in this print, so we can all see it doesn't fit." The crowd turned. Every eye was on Bridger. He did not move. Old Pruitt spoke, his voice carrying across the silent hillside. "Well, Mr. Bridger, you've got a boot. The valley's watching. Put it in the print." Bridger's smile was gone. His face was pale, and his hands were clenched at his sides. He looked at the print, at Eliza, at the crowd, and he did not step forward. "I don't need to prove anything to a pack of farmers," he said. "This is a girl's nonsense. She cut her own trellis for pity. Everyone knows it." "Then put your boot in the print," said Mrs. Hellstrom, her voice like iron. "If it doesn't fit, we'll all go home and stop bothering you." The silence stretched. A wind blew across the hillside. Bridger did not move. And in that stillness, the truth settled over the crowd, like the frost had settled over the valley, cold, undeniable, and final. The valley knew. Eliza looked at him, and she saw his power crumble, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, quiet withdrawal, like a man stepping backward into shadow. He said nothing more. He turned, walked to his buggy, and drove down the hill without a word. The crowd watched him go, and then they turned back to the wall, to the red fruit, to the warm stone, and the questions began. "Can you show us how to build one of these? Will the wall work on any south-facing stone? How many seeds did you start with?" She answered them all. She showed them the ledger, the measurements, the watering schedule. She gave away a dozen ripe tomatoes for seed, and she promised to help any family that wanted to build a trellis of their own before next spring. They stayed until the afternoon, walking the wall, learning, asking, and when the last wagon rolled down the hill, Eliza Thorne was not a laughingstock. She was the woman who had beaten the frost, and tomorrow she would teach the whole valley how to do it. The days following the gathering felt like a slow turning of the tide. Eliza woke each morning to the same cold sky, the same frost on the window, but the silence that had pressed against her chest was gone. In its place was a hum, a quiet undercurrent of activity that reached her even from the valley below. Wagons moved along the road, not aimlessly, but with purpose. Men stood in clusters at the crossroads, pointing at their own south-facing walls, measuring and nodding. The idea had taken root. She spent the first week after the gathering visiting farms. Old Pruitt was the first to ask for help. He met her at the bottom of his lane, his hands in his pockets, his face a study in hard-won humility. "I've got a south wall on the barn," he said. "Never thought much of it. But if you're willing, I'd like to try." They spent the morning driving hoops and stringing twine. Pruitt worked beside her without complaint, his old hands steady on the hammer. When they finished, he stood back and looked at the skeleton of iron and cord, and he said, "It doesn't look like much." "It will," she said. "By July, it'll be green as a meadow." He nodded slowly, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with a string. "This was my wife's," he said. "She died 10 years ago. She had a way with seeds. Kept them in this pouch, lined with beeswax. I'd like you to have it. For the seeds you're giving away." She took the pouch, and her throat tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." "Don't thank me. I'm thanking you. You've given this valley something to hold on to." The visits multiplied. Mrs. Hellstrom wanted a trellis on the chicken coop, which had a good southern exposure. The Bellwethers, who had mocked her the loudest, came quietly one evening, their wagon empty, their faces drawn. Mrs. Bellwether stood at the edge of the yard and said, "I was wrong about you. I see that now." Eliza showed her how to build a simple trellis against the back of their cabin, and Mrs. Bellwether worked in silence, her hands efficient, her eyes avoiding the memory of her own laughter. By the end of September, there were trellises on a dozen properties in the valley. Some were crude, made with scrap wood and binder twine, but they faced south, and they would hold the warmth. Eliza had given away most of her seed, keeping only enough for her own spring planting. She had not sold a single trellis. She had not asked for payment. In return, she had received eggs and preserves, a cured ham, a bolt of flannel, and the quiet respect of people who had once counted her out. The money from her tomato sales, combined with the small gifts of food, was enough to keep her fed and warm through October, but it was not enough to pay the debt. Bridger had not come to the cabin since the gathering, but his presence was a shadow that lengthened with each passing week. She heard from Daniel that he was telling anyone who would listen that the trellises were a fad, that the stone walls would crack under the moisture, that she had tricked the valley into building something that would fall apart in a year. "He's desperate," Daniel said one evening, as they sat at his forge watching the fire. Ruthie was asleep on a cot in the corner, a rag doll clutched to her chest. "He's lost his standing. The valley doesn't trust him anymore. But he's still got the note on your land, and he's still got the bank's ear. The note is due at the end of October," she said. "I've got $120. The note is $400. You've got a crop of green tomatoes that will ripen on the wall for another month. You've got seed that people will buy in the spring. You've got knowledge that the whole valley now needs. That's worth something." "It isn't cash." "No," he said, "but it might be leverage." She did not understand what he meant until the following week, when a letter arrived from the bank in Hood River. It was addressed to her, on stiff paper, and it was signed by the bank president himself. The letter stated that, due to unusual circumstances, the bank was willing to extend her loan for an additional year, at a reduced interest rate, provided she could produce a letter of endorsement from 5 established farmers in the valley. She read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. It was not a full solution. It was something better, a chance. A door left ajar. She wrote the letters herself, with pen and ink, and she delivered them by hand. Old Pruitt signed without hesitation. Mr. Hellstrom signed, and Mrs. Hellstrom added her own mark. The Bellwethers, still red-faced with shame, signed. And the fifth was a man named Jacob Stroud, who farmed the far end of the valley and had lost everything in the frost. He signed with his thumbprint because he could not read, and he said, "You saved my family, Miss Thorne. Least I can do." She sent the letters to the bank and waited. The days grew shorter, the leaves turned and fell. The valley braced for winter. December came with a hard freeze that lasted a week. The Hellstroms lost 2 calves to the cold. Old Pruitt's pipe froze and burst, but the trellises stood empty, waiting for spring. And Eliza's cabin, with its south wall still warm at dusk, became a place where people gathered on cold evenings, sitting by the fire, talking about planting and hope. She had not seen Bridger since October. She heard he had taken to drinking, that his wife had left him, that the mercantile was losing trade to a new store opening in a neighboring town. She did not gloat. She only felt a quiet relief, as if a storm had passed without touching her. But the storm was only gathering. On the first day of March, when the snow was still deep on the hills and the ground was frozen hard, a rider came up the lane. It was a boy from the bank, his horse steaming, a letter in his hand. She opened it standing in the doorway, and the cold rushed in around her. The bank regretted to inform her that the endorsement letters had been reviewed, but the loan extension had been denied. An anonymous complaint had been lodged, questioning her character and her farming methods. The bank was unable to approve the extension without further investigation, which would take at least 6 months. Meanwhile, the original note would be called due at the end of the month. 6 months. The note was due in 30 days. The complaint was anonymous, but she knew the handwriting on the copy the bank enclosed. She had seen it on 100 receipts. It was Bridger's. She stood in the doorway, the letter trembling in her hand, and she looked out at the white hills, the bare trellises, the cold sky. The warmth of the stone at her back was the only warmth she had left. And she knew, with a clarity that felt like a knife, that she had to find a way to pay the note in 30 days, or she would lose everything. That evening she went to Daniel's forge. He was working late, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Ruthie was asleep in the back room. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he set down his hammer and looked at the fire. 30 days, he said. 30 days. How much do you need? $280. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I've got $80 saved. It's yours. I can't take your savings. You can, and you will. It's not charity. It's an investment. When you own this land, I want to be the first to buy a trellis kit from you. She stared at him, and something cracked inside her chest. She had not let herself cry in months. She did not cry now, but her voice was rough when she said, That still leaves $200. Can you sell the rest of your seed? I've given most of it away. I've got enough for my own planting and some to trade, but not $200 worth. Then we need another plan. They sat in the forge until the fire burned low, talking through possibilities. A loan from Pruitt, a partnership with the Hellstroms, a sale of timber from the back of her property. Nothing felt solid. The clock was ticking, and the cold was still deep. As she walked home that night, the stars bright overhead, she passed the wall and pressed her hand to the stone. It was cold on the surface, but beneath, the warmth stirred, just barely, the memory of the day's weak sun. She had held against frost and mockery and sabotage. She had built something the valley had never seen. And now, she needed to hold against the one enemy she had not prepared for, bankruptcy. But as she stood there, the wind pulling at her shawl, an idea flickered at the edge of her mind. It was faint, almost formless, but it had the shape of something her mother had said. When the land gives you nothing, the old woman had whispered, you have to look for what the land is hiding. She walked inside and lit the lantern. She opened the seed tin, the one her mother had sewn into the hem of her coat. Inside, beneath the paper packets of beans and squash, there was a small leather pouch she had never noticed before. She pulled it out, untied the string, and poured the contents into her palm. It was not seeds. It was gold dust. a small handful, fine and bright, mixed with the grit of the journey west. Her mother had carried gold across the plains, hidden in the hem of her coat, and Eliza had never known. She sat on the floor, the gold dust in her palm, and she began to cry. She dried her eyes with the back of her hand, the gold dust still warm against her palm. She poured it carefully back into the leather pouch, tied the string, and held it in both hands as if it were a living thing. Her mother had carried this across the plains, through winters and sickness and loss, and had never once mentioned it. Eliza wondered what else her mother had hidden, what other secrets the old woman had taken to her grave. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire with the pouch in her lap, turning it over, feeling the small weight of the gold. It was not enough to make her rich, but it was enough to change the arithmetic. $500, she guessed, maybe a little less. Enough to pay the debt and have something left for seed and feed and the spring planting. At first light she went to Daniel's forge. He was already at work, the fire roaring, his face streaked with soot. She held out the pouch and told him what she had found. He took it, opened it, and poured a little of the dust into his palm, rubbing it between his fingers. "It's real," he said. "Fine gold. Placer dust, from a riverbed. Your mother must have panned it herself. She never said a word. She was saving it for you. She just didn't get to say where she put it." Eliza nodded. "I need to take it to Hood River, to the assayer. If I try to use it here, Bridger will find a way to stop me." "I'll drive you," he said. "Ruthie can stay with the Hellstroms." They left within the hour, the wagon rattling down the frozen road, the pouch tucked into a pocket sewn inside Eliza's coat. The sky was gray and heavy, promising more snow. The river was low and dark between the ice-crusted banks. Neither of them spoke much. The wind was too cold for talk. They reached Hood River by midday. The town was small, a single street of wooden buildings, but it had a bank and an assayer's office, which was more than their own valley could claim. Eliza went in alone, the pouch in her hand. The assayer was an old man with spectacles and a kind face. He weighed the dust, tested it with acid, and wrote out a certificate of purity. "Fine gold," he said. $320 worth, at current rates." Her heart sank. She had hoped for more. But $320 was enough, combined with Daniel's $80, to cover the note and leave a little margin. She took the certificate and the cash, signed the receipt, and walked out into the cold light, her coat heavy with the weight of the money. Daniel was waiting in the wagon. "How much?" $320. "With your $80, I can pay the note and have $40 left for spring." He smiled, a rare thing. "That's enough." They drove home through the fading afternoon, the sun low and white behind the clouds. The valley lay quiet under its blanket of snow. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the farm she had helped, and she felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with the money in her pocket. But when they turned up her lane, she saw something that stopped the feeling cold. A buggy stood in her yard. Bridger's buggy. And Bridger himself was sitting on her step, his hands folded, his face set in a smile that did not reach his eyes. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward him, her boots crunching in the frozen snow. Daniel stayed behind, his hand resting on the hammer at his belt. "Miss Thorne," Bridger said, rising, "I heard you made a trip to Hood River." "News travels fast." "It does, especially when a woman alone sells gold dust to an assayer. My cousin works in that office. He sent word." She said nothing. She waited. "I've come to make you an offer," he said. "I know you've got money now, enough to pay your note, but I've been thinking, and I've decided I don't want the note paid. I want the land. It's not for sale." "Everything is for sale, Miss Thorne, and I've filed a claim with the county. I'm contesting your ownership of the gold dust. I'm saying it came from a mine on a property I own, and you stole it." "That's a lie. It's a legal claim. It'll take months to sort out, and meanwhile the bank will freeze your payment. The note will come due at the end of the month, and you won't be able to pay it because your money will be tied up in litigation." He spread his hands. "I'm giving you a chance. Sell me the land now for a fair price, and I'll drop the claim. You can keep the gold dust. You can start over somewhere else." She looked at him, at the thin smile and the cold eyes, and she understood the trap he had laid. He could not beat her wall. He could not beat her knowledge. But he could bury her in paperwork, in legal fees, in the slow grind of a system that favored men with money and connections. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take tonight," he said. "But tomorrow I'll file the claim. You have until morning." He climbed into his buggy and drove off, the wheels leaving 2 dark lines in the snow. Eliza stood in the yard, the money still heavy in her coat, and she felt the warmth of the south wall against her back. She had beaten the frost, the mockery, the cut netting. But she had not beaten Bridger, not yet. She went inside and built up the fire, and she took out her mother's seed tin. She emptied it completely, spreading the contents across the table. Packets of seeds, a few dried beans, a button, a folded piece of paper. She unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in her mother's hand, dated 1858, from a mining camp in California. "Dear daughter," it read, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I have hidden a pouch of gold dust in the bottom of the seed tin. It is yours. I earned it working a claim with your father before he died. The deed to that claim is filed in Sacramento under my maiden name, Sarah Evans. No one can take it from you. Use it to buy land or to keep the land you have. Your father always said the best investment was ground that faced the sun." Eliza read the letter 3 times, the words blurring. A deed, a legal claim, proof that the gold was hers. But Sacramento was 1,000 miles away, and she had 30 days. She sat at the table, the letter in her hands, and she thought. The bank in Hood River had the assayer's certificate. The letter was dated and signed. Bridger's claim was a bluff, but a dangerous one. If she could get a copy of the deed from Sacramento by mail in time, she could stop him. But the mail took weeks. The snow was deep, and Bridger had already shown he would lie, cheat, and cut her trellis to get what he wanted. She looked at the south wall through the window, the snow on the stones, the bare hoops waiting for spring. She had built something from nothing, had held against the worst the valley could throw at her. She would not let a man in a buggy take it all away. She put the letter back in the tin, tucked the money into her apron pocket, and went out to the forge. Daniel was still there, working the bellows, the fire casting long shadows. She told him about the letter, about the deed in Sacramento. "Can you get a telegraph to the county clerk there?" she asked. "Ask for a copy of the deed, certified." "I can try," he said, "but the lines are down east of the mountains. The storm last week took out the poles. It might be weeks before they're repaired. Then I need to go myself." "Eliza, it's 1,000 miles. Winter in the mountains. You'll never make it in time." She stood in the warm glow of the forge, and she thought of her mother, crossing those same mountains with a baby in her arms, and gold dust in her hem. She thought of the south wall, warm against the cold. She thought of the valley, the trellises, the families who were counting on her to show them a way forward. "I have to try," she said. He looked at her for a long time, then he nodded slowly. "I'll go with you." She shook her head. "You have Ruthie. You can't leave her. The Hellstroms will keep her." "No," she said. "This is my fight, my inheritance, my land. I need to do it alone." He started to argue, but she held up her hand. "I need you here," she said. "I need you to watch the wall, to keep Bridger from cutting it again, to tell the valley what I'm doing. I need you to be my voice while I'm gone." He was silent, struggling. Finally he said, "When do you leave?" "At first light." She did not sleep that night. She packed a bag, a blanket, the letter, the gold dust, and the money. She left a note for Daniel, instructions for the wall, a list of seeds to start if she did not return in time. She stood at the south wall in the dark, pressing her hand to the cold stone, and she whispered a prayer that she would see it again. The morning came gray and bitter. She hitched the wagon, loaded what little she could carry, and drove down the lane without looking back. The road led east toward the mountains, toward Sacramento, toward a deed that would save her land. At the edge of the valley she passed the mercantile. Bridger was standing on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her go. He smiled and raised his cup in a mock salute. She did not wave back. She set her face toward the mountains and drove. The snow began to fall. The road east was a white ribbon winding through a world that had forgotten color. Eliza drove with her shoulders hunched against the wind, the reins frozen stiff in her hands, the horse picking its way through the drifted snow. She had not gone more than 10 miles when she realized the wagon would not make it. The wheels sank to the hubs in a drift, and the horse stood trembling, steam rising from its flanks, unable to pull free. She climbed down, her legs numb, and unhitched the mare. She took the saddle blanket, the bag with the money and the letter, and the small pouch of gold dust. She left the wagon where it sat, a hump of wood and iron in the white waste, and she rode the mare bareback into the storm. The mare was a sturdy thing, a Morgan mix with a deep chest and steady eyes. It carried her through the long afternoon, into the evening, past the last farm she recognized, and into the foothills. The snow did not let up. It fell in a steady, silent curtain, erasing the trail, erasing the world. She stopped when she could no longer feel her fingers and built a fire in the lee of a rock outcropping. She huddled against the stone, the mare standing with its back to the wind, and she thought of the south wall, of the warmth that waited there, of her mother crossing the same mountains alone with a child. She slept fitfully and woke to a clear dawn. The mountains stood sharp against the sky, their peaks dark with pine. She rode on, following the river, which was frozen at the edges but running black in the center. The miles passed slowly, measured in the stiffening of her joints and the growing emptiness of her stomach. She had packed bread and dried meat, but she rationed it carefully. She did not know how long the journey would take. On the third day, she reached a settlement called Nevada City, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled in a valley. She sold the mare for a fare on the stagecoach that ran to Sacramento, a rattling, jolting contraption that carried her through the mountains in 2 days of bone-shaking travel. She arrived in Sacramento on the 5th day after leaving home, her clothes stiff with dirt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The county clerk's office was a brick building on a wide street. She walked in, the letter from her mother in her hand, and she asked for the deed filed under the name Sarah Evans. The clerk was a young man with a bored expression and a stack of ledgers. He found the entry in 20 minutes. The deed was real, filed in 1858 for a mining claim on the American River. Her mother had owned it outright, and because Eliza was her only living child, the claim passed to her by inheritance. The clerk made a certified copy, stamped and sealed, and handed it over. Eliza paid the fee with the last of her gold dust and walked out into the Sacramento sun, the paper warm in her hands. She had done it. She had proof. The journey back was faster, fueled by the urgency of the approaching deadline. She took the stagecoach as far as Nevada City, bought a horse with the last of her cash, and rode through the mountains in a blur of cold and distance. The snow had melted on the lower slopes, and the road was mud, slow and treacherous. She pushed on, sleeping in barns and haystacks, eating what she could buy or trade. She made it to Hood River on the 28th day. The note was due in 2 days. She did not stop in town. She rode straight for the valley, past the Hellstrom place, past the bellwethers, up the long hill to her own lane. The cabin stood gray and silent against the March sky. The south wall was bare, the hoops waiting, the stone cold in the afternoon light. She dismounted, her legs nearly giving way, and she saw the paper nailed to her door. A notice of foreclosure. The bank had scheduled the auction for the following morning. She tore it down and went inside. The fire was dead. The cabin was cold. She built it up with trembling hands and sat on the floor, the certified deed in her lap, and she let herself feel the weight of what she had done. She had crossed the mountains. She had found the proof. She had come home with 2 days to spare. At dawn, she rode down to the bank in Hood River. The president was a man named Harrison, gray and stern, who had approved the loan extension and then withdrawn it. He looked up when she entered, and his face betrayed nothing. "Miss Thorne, I assume you've seen the notice." "I have, and I've brought something that changes the situation." She laid the certified deed on his desk. He picked it up, read it, and his eyebrows rose. "This is a mining claim on the American River, filed in 1858 under Sarah Evans, my mother. The gold dust I sold came from that claim. It belonged to her, and it belongs to me. Mr. Bridger's legal claim is fraudulent." Harrison read the deed again, slowly. He set it down and looked at her with something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or surprise. "Where did you get this?" "I rode to Sacramento and brought it back." "Alone?" alone. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer, took out a file, and wrote something across the front. The foreclosure is rescinded. Your loan is extended for 3 years at the reduced rate. I'll have the papers drawn up this afternoon. And Mr. Bridger's claim. He will be informed that his complaint has been dismissed, and I will inform the county that he has filed a fraudulent claim against a legitimate property owner. That will be noted on his record. She nodded, her hands steady now. Thank you. I should thank you, he said. The valley has been talking about your trellis, about the frost, about the way you gave away your seed. That kind of reputation is worth more than any deed. She walked out of the bank into the cold March light, and she felt the land beneath her feet, solid and hers. She rode home through the valley, and every farm she passed had a south-facing wall marked with hoops and twine, waiting for the spring planting. The Hellstrom's chicken coop, old Pruitt's barn, even the Bellwether's cabin, humble and bare, but turned toward the sun. She reached her own lane and found a crowd gathered in her yard. Daniel was there, with Ruthie in his arms. Old Pruitt, the Hellstroms, Jacob Stroud, a dozen others. They had come to stand with her, to face the auction together. She climbed down from the horse, and she told them what had happened. The deed, the bank, the dismissal of Bridger's claim. They cheered, a rough and ragged sound that echoed off the hills. But she was not done. She had one more thing to do. She walked to the edge of the crowd, where Silas Bridger stood alone, his buggy parked at the bottom of the lane. He had heard the news. His face was the color of ash. He turned to go, and she called out, "Mr. Bridger!" He stopped. She walked toward him, the crowd falling silent behind her. She stopped 10 feet away, and she looked at him with a calm that she had not known she possessed. "You tried to take my land," she said. "You cut my trellis. You spread lies about me. You filed a false claim. I have witnesses to all of it. I could have you prosecuted, run out of the valley. I could make sure no bank within 100 miles ever gives you credit again." He stared at her, his mouth open, his hands hanging useless at his sides. Silence carried across the hillside, thick as the frost had been. "I'm not going to do any of that," she said, "because I don't need to. You did this to yourself. You had the land, you had the store, you had a whole valley that trusted you, and you threw it away because you couldn't stand to see a woman succeed where you had failed." Her voice was quiet, but it carried, sharp as the winter air. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Bridger. I never was. I was just a woman trying to keep my mother's land, and I've kept it. You can go now. But when you go, I want you to remember this. The frost comes for everyone, but the warmth that holds it back, that's not luck. That's work. That's knowledge. That's a woman who refused to be moved." He looked at her, and something in his face crumpled. Not into anger, but into a recognition that seemed to reach down into something older and more worn. He took a breath and he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You're right." He swallowed. "I've been wrong, Miss Thorne. Wrong about the wall, wrong about you, wrong about everything. I ain't saying it to get out of trouble. I'm saying it 'cause it's true. I never seen a woman do what you done. Cross the mountains alone, beat the frost, beat me. You earned this land." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Hellstrom wiped her eyes. Old Pruitt nodded slowly. Daniel set Ruthie down, and the little girl walked to Eliza and took her hand, looking up at her with the unguarded wonder of a child. Bridger turned and climbed into his buggy. He drove down the lane without looking back, and the valley let him go. That evening, Eliza stood at the south wall with Daniel and Ruthie. The sun was low, casting a long golden light across the hills. She pressed her hand to the stone. It was cold on the surface, but beneath, the day's warmth was gathering, waiting for the night. She took Ruthie's small hand and pressed it to the stone. "Do you feel that?" she asked. The girl nodded. "That's the sun, hiding, waiting. It'll hold us through the cold." "Like your mama held you?" Ruthie said. Eliza felt her throat tighten. She looked at the girl, at the bright eyes, at Daniel standing behind her with his quiet, steady presence. She thought of her mother's voice in the dark of a sod house, pressing her hand to the chimney stone, teaching her to feel what the world was hiding. "Just like that," she said. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.